Hello and welcome everyone. I see a lot of people coming into this webinar, and once again, it's very gratifying uh, to be joined by people all over the world for this Global Investigative Journalism Network webinar on investigating the pandemic. And the webinar today is on contracts, investigating the billions of dollars of COVID-19 related government contracts that have been awarded all over the world. Welcome everyone. I can see more people joining us. My name is Anne Koch and I'm the Program Director at the Global Investigative Journalism Network. And I'm going to be your moderator today. I'm delighted to be with you today. I'm sure you've worked out by now that we're offering the translation in Russian. It's a little complicated, so I just quickly wanted to run through how you get English and then how you get Russian. You can choose between the two, and you have to make an active choice. So it doesn't defer to English. You have to choose English by, first of all, selecting the globe-looking icon in the bottom right-hand corner of the screen. You can see the instructions there where you select English, and then you have to select Mute Original Audio. If you want to listen to the webinar in Russian, you choose again the same globe-looking icon, and then you select Russian, and again select Mute Original Audio. It's incredibly important to select Mute Original Audio, or you're going to be hearing two languages in your ears at once, which is rather difficult to understand. Now, we're going to remove this instruction shortly, but we're going to put the instruction on how to do this into our chat box. So if you're still not quite sure how to get English or how to get Russian, please look in our chat box. So again, welcome to everyone joining this webinar. It's the 11th global webinar, and it's certainly not our last one. With the spread of bogus science, fraudulent products, and official cover-ups, there's plenty of work for journalists all over the world to do, and that includes checking out the billions of dollars worth of government contracts that are related to COVID-19, which, as I said, is what we're talking about today. The challenge, of course, is to find out who's getting the contracts and what they're using the money for. And this is made even more difficult by the use of emergency procurement procedures and restrictions on access to information, which we're seeing everywhere at the moment. Having said that, despite that, there's been very many great reports being done every day on procurement-related stories. So it is quite possible to investigate. I'll introduce the speakers in a moment. We've got some great speakers today. I just first wanted to say a little bit about GIJN, Global Investigative Journalism Network, for those of you who aren't familiar with us. We're the largest global network of nonprofit investigative journalism organizations, and at the moment we have 187 members. In 78 countries around the world. But it's important to say that we work with journalists everywhere, in nonprofits, in the commercial sector, and with freelancers. And I want to call your attention now for a moment to our resource center, because in fact, we've launched a guide earlier this week, a resource guide that's directly relevant to this webinar on contracts. And the guide is called Researching Government Contracts for COVID-19 Spending. I don't think it could be clearer. And it provides tips and tools on how to pursue such stories. Along with published examples, as I said, there's quite a lot of stories being done already on this, and we hope to we will translate it in a number of languages. You can find it on our website, gijn.org. We'll also share the presentations today with you. So now to the important part, our speakers, and I'm truly delighted that we're joined by two very experienced investigative journalists today and an expert on contracts to share their strategies and tips. First of all, I'd like to introduce the Russian investigative reporter, Roman Anin. Many of you may know him. He is the co-founder and editor-in-chief of a new investigative newsroom, and in English it's translated as Important Stories or iStories. Roman is a reporter whose investigations with Russia's Novaya Gazeta and with OCCRP, the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project, are well known and have revealed major cases of corruption and cronyism in Russia and globally. Second up is Ernesto Cabral. He's an investigative reporter at Ojo Público, which is leading COVID-19 procurement investigation in Peru, among many other things. And as I understand it, it's the second worst hit country from COVID in Latin America, I believe, after Brazil. Ernesto also has a very long track record in investigative journalism. And our third speaker, Sophie Brown, is an expert from the Open Contracting Partnership, which is an NGO seeking to work with governments, business, civil society, and media to transform public contracting through open data. So I'd like to extend a big welcome to our three speakers. Before we go to Roman Anin, I'd like to, just to make it clear that we'd love to hear from the audience. And so from now, anytime throughout this the webinar, you can send your written questions to our Q&A box, if you wouldn't mind. And of course, we'll get to as many as we can. You can also send your questions in Russian, and they will be translated. So all speakers, Russian and English, please send your questions. Each speaker will take about 10 minutes or so, and then my GIJN colleague Eunice Au will join us to moderate the questions. So she'll share them with the whole audience. My final point before we start is that just to let everyone know, we're recording this webinar. We'll put it up on YouTube later. So just to let you know, we're recording. Great. So without further ado, Roman, over to you, please. Please put your speaker on. Thanks. Unmute yourself.
Yeah, hi everybody. So I wanted to tell you about one story that we did when we launched our media. And this is the story about procurement and the story about mechanical ventilators. So the kind of equipment, as you know, that has become one of the most important in the pandemic. And in some countries, these ventilators are literally saving lives. And Russia, as many other countries, faced the pandemic with a severe deficit of ventilators. So we decided to investigate why we faced this deficit and who were the main beneficiaries of the contracts that on the mechanical ventilators. And it's actually interesting because our story was developing all the time. So we decided to start with checking who was actually importing those ventilators in Russia, because we thought that the major suppliers of ventilators were companies that sold foreign equipment. So ventilators that are produced in Germany, in the US, or in other countries. But we were actually surprised when we started with our story that it was not the case, and that the majority of ventilators that were sold to Russian hospitals were actually produced in Russia, or at least they claimed that they were produced in Russia. And it was our first interesting finding. Then we realized that actually the way those ventilators were sold was dodgy as well, because on the eve of the pandemic, Russian government adopted the kind of rules that blacklisted all ventilators produced outside of the country, meaning that hospitals, when hospitals had to buy this equipment, in the first place, they had to buy the equipment produced in Russia. And this was a very controversial law because Russian doctors, those who actually work with ventilators, they said that those ventilators produced in Russia are actually worse and they're not so convenient and so on. And then when we actually realized that we have to look into Russian ventilators rather than foreign ventilators, we had to be creative in the way how we get the data and in the way how we analyze the data. Because there are plenty of contracts on mechanical ventilators, and how do you find the story in those contracts, right? And in the old times, it would have taken, I don't know, probably weeks and weeks of work and many, many bodies. But with new technologies and with automation, you can do things really more efficient and more efficiently, and you can do better stories and quicker stories. So we actually came up with a code with a small script that gathered all state contracts, Russian state contracts for us, analyzed the suppliers, and also the price of the contract. And in the end, we actually found that the main suppliers of mechanical ventilators in Russia were bogus companies, registered on the eve of the contracts, registered on nominal shareholders, people who work on construction, people on students, or even people who were lost. And these bogus companies, they were reselling, they were not paying taxes, and they were reselling those ventilators at inflated prices. Meaning that when the plant that produces ventilators was selling them for, I don't know, $1.5 million rubles, the very same bogus companies were selling at higher prices. So how we were able to find it? I want to share my screen now and show you some code that we use that might be useful for you as well. I hope that you can see my screen now.
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. So just let me run very quickly through code. And while I do that, let me actually run the code so that we don't waste our time to see it running. So we are using actually this database going, which is called clearspending.ru. This is an amazing database that people from Russia probably know. If you're not from Russia and you want to analyze Russian state contracts, then this is one of the best places you can go to get data. So just let me show you quickly what's the database. So this is the interface of the database, and you can go to contracts, and you can see that it's even in English. And you can search by the supplier, by the name of the contract. But what's even better about this database that it provides an IP servers. So it provides an IP which allows you to actually automatically get the data. So you see, I'm just getting some contracts in the range of this price, and there are 500 contracts, and now it means that I can write a script that will allow me to get this data automatically. So if I get back to my code, you see that it has executed. What it does actually, it goes through all the contracts with this OKPD number. OKPD means the number of the equipment. So every equipment, everything that companies actually sell to state bodies has its unique number. And mechanical ventilators have their unique number as well. So we're looking by this unique number. Then by number of the, and then by the date. And you see that we were analyzing all contracts for the last 5 years, from 15 to the 20s. So it goes through all the contracts, and then we get onto the data that we need. And this is the URL on the original contract, which you can, you can go to the state contract and state database and get this original contract. Product name, price, quantity, customer, ENN, which is the ENN of the customer. And in the end, you actually get this, we make it really simple. We get a CSV file with all the contracts and with top suppliers. So new is all contracts and top suppliers. And this is the name of the mechanical ventilator, the most popular mechanical ventilator in Russia that we were analyzing. So we get the CSV file, which looks like this. So the whole file is, it shows you it gives you the URL on the contract, the number of the contract, then who actually ordered the mechanical ventilator. So these are the names of the hospitals. These are the suppliers. This is the date. This is actually the name of the equipment. And this is also the price, both in rubles and in dollars. So the script is written in a way that allows you to analyze not only prices on Russian mechanical ventilators, but also on foreign mechanical ventilators. And we do that by using this library called Forex Converter. And yeah, I mean, this are all contracts. And if you go back, you can also get like the top 10. And when we got the top 10 or the top 20, it depends on how many you want, we actually started analyzing all these companies, and this is how we found those bogus companies that are all connected with each other. So all those bogus companies, despite being controlled by nominees, they actually were part of the whole group of bogus companies. They were part of the whole chain. And we talked to actually, and this was like the part that we did like in a couple of days. And then we actually had to go back to the original methods of reporting, when we had to call people, when we had to call doctors, when we had to call victims, when we had to call authorities and ask them why these things were going on. So I really loved our approach, because it's like a combination of the new tools with the traditional the traditional methods of investigative reporting when you talk to people. And what is also interesting about this project is that we invested, some time in writing the code and writing the script, but now we can reproduce our approach in different stories. Because yes, today mechanical ventilators are very important, but who knows what's going to happen tomorrow? And maybe we will have to analyze, I don't know, airplanes or tanks or whatever. And we already, have the approach, and we already have the tool that will allow us to reproduce our approach in future stories. And I think that that's all. And thank you for your attention.
Yeah, thanks. Could I just have a couple of follow-up questions? What made you think you needed to investigate ventilators as opposed to anything else? There's so many contracts going on.
Well, because there were a lot of news that Russian hospitals had a deficit of ventilators, and people were dying without ventilators, and it was a big problem in Spain. When doctors
Sure.
had actually to choose between people, to whom they give ventilators. And simultaneously, afterwards, actually, the later news unfortunately proved why our story was so important, because these very same ventilators that we investigated and that, were actually bad, hospitals had to cancel contracts on those ventilators. So those hospitals that did not cancel, in some of them, in 2 of them, actually, those ventilators burned and they killed 6 people.
Oh, goodness. Yes. So, yeah, it's very significant in that sense, isn't it, as well? Yeah, interesting. So the middle process you're describing, where you use logarithm to do a search in that, how replicable is that for other people listening? You said it, you can use it elsewhere, or others can use it. Can you say a little more about that before we move to Ernesto?
Well, yeah, I mean, if you are working with Russian state contracts, then definitely, you can just use the same technique for any type of product. If you work in a different country, then of course it depends how open is the data. If
Yeah.
the procurement is closed, if it doesn't have this API services, then it's difficult. I wouldn't say it's impossible, but it's difficult. But still, you just gotta understand the procurement really well to know the type of stories you are looking at. So in this case, we were looking for bogus suppliers that inflated prices. There are many other violations. I don't know, when the equipment is bad or something else, or when there is fake competition between companies. But we know the procurement, and that is why we knew what we were looking for.
Yeah, thank you for that. Very interesting. And I'm sure Sophie will tell us a little more about certain things to look out for, whether you've got enough open data or not. We'll get to you in a moment, Sophie. But first, Ernesto, please, over to you.
Thank you for the introduction. I'm going to share my screen. Just let me know if you can see it, please.
Yeah, we're still waiting. It hasn't quite come yet, but there we go. And now if you make it bigger, thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, if you could put it into present mode, Ernesto, I don't know. Thanks. Perfect. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you. Well, I'm very honored and happy to be in this webinar. So I want to start with a little bit of context of the Peruvian fight against COVID-19 pandemic. In brief, we have not received good news in the last couple of weeks, despite we were one of the first Latin American countries to go into lockdown. The number of new COVID-19 patients and diseases has jumped dramatically in this period. And there is no sign that the actual measures implemented by the Peruvian government are going to flatten the curve, at least this month. I highly recommend an article on this issue written by Dan Collins and published on The Guardian. There he gave a good explanation on the causes of this failure in confronting COVID-19. So in this context, at Ojo Público, we are tracking procurement processes amid COVID-19 emergency. Our government has approved and transferred at least $75 million that can be used in single bidding or procurement procedures with only one bidder. And as Sophie might explain in a couple of minutes, these non-competitive procedures have high risk of corruption. So let me give you 3 advices on how to track these procurement contracts amid COVID-19 pandemic. First of all, journalists should know and understand the rules of the game. For example, we kept track of all the legal documents published by our government during this emergency, and that have to do with procurement regulation. We have a simple spreadsheet in Google Drive where we register the date of publication, the sector that published the document, and a brief explanation on how this document affects or changes the procurement regulation in our country. So why is this important? It might seem obvious, but if you know in advance the rules of the game, it will be much easier to identify wrongdoings in procurement. This kind of journalism 101, but it's important to keep this practice. And second, because we as a journalist should be aware of how much regulation is the government sacrificing in order to increase the speed of these procedures. Mm. So the second tip has to do with knowing the players. For example, the COVID-19 test is a huge market right now. So at Ojo Público, we made a data set with the main manufacturers of those tests from all over the world. We identified about 70 companies that manufacture PCR molecular tests, mainly from USA and China, and another 40 companies that manufacture the so-called rapid tests to detect COVID-19. From this last group, almost 50% of them are located in China, as you can see in the screenshot in the slide. So obviously, this data set is incomplete, and I must encourage you to check our list and find more players in your own countries. How can we get access to this information? Well, first of all, there are some NGOs that are keeping track of these companies, like the Foundation for Innovative New Diagnosis from Switzerland, and also some governments that have published an official list of the authorized tests in each of these countries. For example, you can find the COVID-19 tests approved in the USA if you search in the CDC website. And finally, the World Health Organization has also an index with the authorized tests in China, South Korea, I think India and Australia, and so on. It's important that you can also check the data of importations and exportations of goods in your country. For example, checking this information, we found that some companies that were introducing COVID-19 tests into Peru, despite they didn't have any contract at the moment with our government. Here, maybe I must emphasize the difference between the manufacturer and the local distributor. Sometimes the local distributor of a COVID-19 test is a subsidiary of a global corporate group. For example, the Switzerland-based Roche laboratory has a subsidiary in Peru named Productos Roche, or Roche Products. This last company is the one which sells COVID-19 tests to our government. In other cases, especially when Chinese companies have been involved, we notice that they aren't present in every country where they sell their products. Take, for example, Origin, that you can see at the bottom of the screen. It's one of the main providers of COVID-19 rapid tests in Peru and some other countries like Spain, but they don't have a subsidiary in each of these countries. In order to operate in Peru, they make business alliance with Peruvian companies which import their rapid tests. Why is important to have in account this difference? Because we are trying to figure out the main players of these huge markets and to identify their presence worldwide. And of course, possible irregularities in procurement. So my advice is to investigate more actors than just the company that signs a contract with the government. Check if they produce the test or any other goods offered in this emergency. Do they represent a pharmaceutical multinational? Have these companies registered importations in the last couple of months? From which countries, from which manufacturers? And it's also important to contact as a source the companies that are not getting access to the procurement process, the ones that are sending their offers to the authorities, but are not being taken into account. They can give you a deeper explanation of how the procurement procedures are taking place, and also check the background of the manufacturers of COVID-19 tests. For example, when our government bought Origin test, this company didn't have an authorization from the Chinese government. Then China made stronger requirements in order to allow a company to export a test or other medical devices. So the consequence was that the Peruvian distributor of Origin had some major delays in delivering these rapid tests. And this is a story that we covered because the delays were a public interest issue. Finally, I should advise you to identify media organizations and independent journalists in other countries that might be interested in becoming allies with you or with your organization. One thing that Panama Papers and the Paradise Papers investigation taught me is that the organized crime and money laundering are crimes that don't respect frontiers. And the same happens here. Big companies are selling COVID-19 tests and other medical devices all over the world. For example, Latin America is an important market for Chinese laboratories. So wouldn't it be great to have an alliance between Peruvian and Chinese journalists? Just to finish, let me give you maybe 2 examples of the benefits of making alliance with other journalists. A colleague from Ecuador told me that their hospitals have problems with Roche, this Switzerland-based laboratory. So what was the issue? Roche manufactured a PCR test named COVAS, but this test only work on PCR machines made also by Roche. You can see an example of where Roche has been selling their COVID-19 tests in the slide. So that creates a technological dependence of our governments to that company. In terms of efficiency, it's not a good idea to have a COVID-19 test that only works or that only can be processed on a machine from a specific brand. So this was happening in Ecuador. I searched in our procurement process. The same story will be repeating in Peruvian soil with the help from this partner in Ecuador who works at El Mercurio, and another journalist from Brazil who works at the Intercept Brazil. We described the technological dependence that Roche was selling to Latin American governments. It wasn't a local issue from one country. It might be a regional project. And the second example is that has to do that in normal times, an overpriced purchase should be a red flag for risk of corruption in procurement. But due to the pandemic and shortage of medical devices, now an overpriced purchase is a more common issue, reinforced by our authorities trying to get their goods or these goods as soon as possible. So a good way to identify corrupt overpriced purchases is to compare the prices of medical devices in different countries of the same region. is Peruvian government buying masks at the same price as Brazilian government? If not, why is it? Is the same manufacturer? So Ojo Público is part of a wider alliance named Red Alta in Spanish, and it's alliance, a network of Latin American media outlets from different countries in Latin America. And we are trying to respond to these questions, this kind of questions that can only be answered if we were close to journalists from our countries. I think that is one of my main advices, to identify allies in other countries, because as you may know, as I said, these purchases, this procurement are not happening only in one country. There are big companies that are selling the same product but at different prices in different countries. So it's a good way to track these billion contracts is to work close with other colleagues and journalists in other countries. So that's all that I have to say right now.
Thank you, Ernesto. Thank you very much. I mean, you talked about the work you're doing with colleagues in Latin America. What about overseas? I mean, I think they're, you know, in Europe and Africa, Asia, elsewhere. Are you working with others? Because you're entirely right about the nature of the global nature of the story, and the companies are global, so the investigations really need to be global. So what progress have you made to do that?
Well, we have a formal alliance with these Latin American newsrooms, but also we have contacted some journalists from other countries, as the Netherlands. Follow the Money is the name in English. I don't know how to pronounce it in.
Follow the Money. That's it. Yeah.
Follow the Money, and also I have a great conversation with some colleagues from Georgia, for example, where Roche is also selling their products. So it's easier now that we have these Zoom calls to get in contact with journalists from other countries overseas. So.
Yeah, sure. And we can keep working on that. That's a really important thing you've said. I agree. One last question from me. Is information pretty transparent there? How hard is data to get in Peru on these issues?
Well, in Peru, there is a public data set that has been made public by our government. But there is a lot of noise in these data sets, a lot of mistakes that has to be. We have to look over it manually. It takes a lot of time, but I think that is a progress if you compare it with the former years. So I can share with you the link of these data sets.
Please do.
So you can also check if you know. Mm-hmm.
Great. Thank you very much. I'm sure there'll be questions. Sophie, over to you now from Open Contracting Partnership.
Yes, hi everyone. I'm a communications advisor at the Open Contracting Partnership. And as Anne mentioned before, we're a nonprofit that supports efforts to reform public procurement systems around the world. And we use an approach that's called open contracting, which is basically about using better public data about government contracting and better discussions among various actors of people who are affected by procurement to make better decisions about procurement policies and processes. And it's really great to be part of this call today and to hear from Roman and Ernesto, because they're doing basically what we promote. Getting all this information and data from governments, structuring it in a way that's understandable and sharing it with the public in a way that they can understand, and everyone gets a better sense of what's happening in the procurement systems. So what I'm going to talk about today is some of the main red flags that you can look for in COVID-19 procurement. And I'm going to actually start with a well-worn metaphor used among anti-corruption advocates. They often describe corruption as a virus. And it's an apt comparison, because like the coronaviruses and other germs that can cause infectious diseases, corruption is very destructive, it spreads easily, and it's really difficult to see. When the new coronavirus hit the Chinese city of Wuhan, we didn't know it was there because we could see the SARS virus itself with its little crown-like nodes, but because we could see its impact. thousands of people were suddenly experiencing flu-like symptoms and respiratory problems, which quickly turned deadly. And corruption operates in a similar way. It manifests in societies through its effects. Most of us probably won't actually see a government official pocketing the cash when he gives his mate $1 million contract for medical supplies. But you will see the doctors and nurses who have to choose which patients' lives to save because they don't have enough ventilators for everyone, or health workers who die themselves because they don't have the right protective equipment to prevent themselves from being exposed to the disease. So as I mentioned before, what I'm going to talk about is some of the clues or symptoms of corruption, mismanagement, and other irregularities that you can look for in emergency procurement deals in response to COVID-19. And we're focusing on public procurement because it's actually the most risky market for corruption. You can think of it as the cruise ship of corruption, if you want to continue the virus analogy. It's where governments spend most of the public's money. It's very technical and complex, so it's hard for people who aren't experts to understand. And the record keeping is mostly so old-fashioned and poorly organized that by the time anyone scrutinizes the records, it's too late, the damage is done. One problem with looking at the symptoms, though, is that they might be indicators of other less harmless illnesses. So just as with COVID-19, you know, if you have a fever and a sore throat, it might be COVID-19 or it might just be a common flu. So it's the same with these red flags that we're going to look at. They might be indicators of intentional bad behavior, or they might just be honest mistakes made through rushed decisions or by staff who are ill-prepared to deal with what is really an unprecedented global pandemic. So proving this difference is really difficult, and that's why you need to take those red flags and investigate them further. And that's, you know, what Roman was talking about. They looked at the data, but then they also did interviews with people, went to speak to other sources. And the more that you look into the red flags, the more you can get a better understanding of which patterns are more likely to be corruption and which ones are more likely to be mistakes. And also, either way, having an understanding of how decisions were made and who made them is really important for public trust and accountability. So let's have a look at some of these red flags now.
You're sharing your screen now, right, Sophie?
Yes, I'm just
Great.
going to share it.
Brilliant.
Going.
Good.
Okay, there we go.
Thank you.
So we actually, at Open Contracting Partnership, we have a full methodology of 150 different red flags that you can look at across the full procurement cycle, from the planning right through to the implementation of the contract. These ones that I'm showing here are probably the main ones you'd want to look at as a journalist in procurement in general. I'm not going to go through all of these individually now because I'm just going to pull out some of the most relevant ones for COVID-19. And just to explain the process a little bit, the planning stage of contracting is when governments decide what they're going to buy. The tender process, part of the process is when they advertise the opportunities and seek proposals from different suppliers. The award process is when they actually do the bidding and decide who's going to win the contract. The contract stage is when they decide the details of the agreement and actually sign the deal. And the implementation is when the suppliers deliver the goods or provide the services and so on. So the first one that we would look at with COVID-19 emergency contracts in particular is price deviations. And this is something, you know, that Roman mentioned as well. You want to look at, for particular items in the market, where where suppliers have particularly high or particularly low offers, or the winning bid is particularly high or low. And there's a few ways you can sort of figure that out. One is to actually look at what the market average is in normally for that particular item. And for example, you can look at the average price for the previous year, or as Ernesto was saying, you can compare the prices across comparable regional markets. So in countries in Latin America, or maybe you could look at Canada and US or in Eastern Europe and compare it that way. There's a really nice example. And also if you have a particularly low price, it may be an indication of fraud. So watch out for that too. In terms of investigations that we've seen that have done this really well, the Colombian magazine Semana did a very nice piece where they looked at the procurement market overall in the country. And one of the things that they found was that there were quite big cost overruns on contracts related to food kits that were being distributed. And some of the items were being inflated by as much as 50% beyond the regular prices. So I'm going to actually, in these slides, I've included a few examples of investigations that we've seen from different places around the world. These are just some here, but if you go to the new guide that GIJN has just published, they have a whole lot of different examples from different countries. And we also have a weekly newsletter that we put out of the latest investigations that we're seeing related to emergency procurement for COVID materials. The next one, which is really good to look at, the next red flag to look at is inexperienced providers. And yeah, as Roman mentioned, when they actually looked at the data, there were all these vendors who had just set up their companies a few days ago. They've never participated in the market before. And that's a huge red flag, particularly if, you know, they're winning the tenders and they've never actually bid on public contracts before. But it's really important, if you're going to look at this indicator, you should also be looking at the age of the firm and what its purpose is and what its capacity is, because there's cases we're seeing, particularly in the COVID market, where a company might not necessarily be like, they might not be a health company, but because they produce textile products, they're starting to produce masks instead. Or if they're a cosmetics company, they might be producing hand sanitizer. So that may not necessarily be an indicator that something bad's going on just because they've never participated, which is why you need to look at other indicators as well. And in terms of cases where this has been common, we saw a really good investigation by ProBulica, which found that a former White House official won a mask contract, and he'd set up the company only 11 days earlier. Okay. So hidden interests. This is the third one you should be looking at. What we want to look at for here is links to politicians, campaign donors, or other conflicts of interest. And there's a couple of data points you can look at for this that might seem kind of obvious, but you'd be surprised how often they come up. One of them is the supplier's contact details. If they have a PO box address and not an actual physical address, or no phone number, that could be an indication that it's just a front company. And there's other cases which we see a lot in Eastern European countries in their data, that the address for the supplier matches the address for a procuring officer, or the same phone number, and you can actually call them up and it's the procuring officer that answers, not the supplier. You also have to look for winning bids, obviously, that don't meet the award criteria. And beyond the contracting data itself, check out suppliers' sanctions list to see if suppliers are listed on them. Maybe they've been blacklisted for corruption already. And check asset declarations of government officials to see if they're related to, you know, any companies that way. And another indicator here that you can look at, it's a little bit trickier to do because often there's not very good data about subcontractors, but if you can get access to invoices or payment details, see if a large percentage of the payments are actually going to the subcontractors, because that could be an indication that the main contractor is actually just a shell company. I'm not going to go through each example here. We'll share the slides afterwards so you can look at the specific cases in each country. So I'm just going to go through the main red flags because we don't have a whole lot of time. So unjustified emergency deals is another one to look at. And here we're looking at contracts that are fast-tracked, but they're not related to the immediate crisis. So, you know, like there's, let's see. So yeah, you want to look at the procurement method. It might be something that's, I don't know, I'm trying to think of an example, but something that is clearly not related to responding to the health emergency or related to providing materials for the lockdown or whatever. But so you wanted to see the procurement method for the contracting process here, what the specifications are of the contract, how long the contract period is, what is the budget source, is it coming from a special emergency fund for COVID response? And some countries, if you're lucky, they're actually tagging their contracts on their procurement portals with COVID so that you can easily find ones that are supposed to be related to COVID spending. Just in terms of, oops. There was a nice example of that actually from a procurement academic in Portugal who discovered a particular contract for face masks that was 9 months long. And according to Portuguese rules, emergency deals are only supposed to be like, I think it's within 3 or 6 months. So the fact that it was a 9-month long contract was an indicator that it wasn't an emergency and it was actually breaking the rules. Unjustified sole source contracts is a really important one for COVID spending because there's a huge amount of contracts being done directly without any competition in order to be able to respond to the crisis quickly. They're shortcutting a lot of the regular rules about giving different companies an opportunity to bid and really deciding, you know, who the best supplier is and who can provide the best price. And one of the things that's really good to look at, one of the great investigations we've been seeing is comparing like the volume and value of contracts that are being done through non-competitive methods rather than competitive spending. And there was a particular investigation that was done by the Wall Street Journal where they showed that in the first few months of the COVID response, New York had spent well beyond what it had actually spent for responding to Hurricane Sandy. Biased resource allocation. So here we want to look at whether spending priorities are actually matching public needs. So look at, say, for example, in the last 3 months, which contracts have the higher value, and are they things that are actually related to the emergency and the priorities that are being set by health experts. And also, are there trivial purchases being made? There was an example from a local government in Moldova where they're going ahead with a quite controversial deal to build a water fountain, a musical water fountain, and the community's been quite upset about that because they said this is not the thing we should be spending on, particularly when there's a recession coming. And the example here that I'd like to use is from Argentina. So they actually found out that the biggest, the most expensive deal in terms of the COVID spending was related to a contract for school books. And it wasn't anything to do with responding to the health emergency itself. So obviously that's an important thing to have children, to be able to get educational materials to children, but, you know, is that really the right priority was the question. So lack of transparency. One of the red flags you can look at is whether the information is available in itself. Because, you know, if you want to hide something, if you want to hide bad behavior, one of the best ways to do it is to keep it secret. So here you want to look at whether critical details at each individual stage of the contracting process are available. Has it been advertised properly? Is information in the contract withheld, particular details? And there's a case in Japan, for example, where there was a mask scheme. There were 4 different suppliers who were asked to provide masks, and the health ministry refused to release the details of one of those particular suppliers, even though they released the details and the name of the other 3. Amendments and cancellations. Now that's another one to look out for. After the contract has been signed, are particular details changed, like the price or the particular specifications? And we haven't seen so many of these cases yet, but if I'm from Australia, so for me, one thing that I would love people to look at is the Australian federal government contracts, because they actually have a lot of really, really good information about amendments, contract amendments in general. So I think that's a really great opportunity to do a story and keep watching that in the next few months and see what comes out of that. So those particular red flags I've been looking at are mostly coming from the tender, award, and contract stages of the contracting process. but it's really important to also look at the planning and implementation phase. So in terms of planning, we're looking at, were authorities adequately prepared? Did they ask for appropriate items in the appropriate quantities? So there was a really great story that the organization DataFight did in Nigeria, where they showed that the ventilators that Nigeria had purchased in the previous year and beyond that, their stockpile was only sufficient for one ventilator to serve 1.3 Nigerians. And then in terms of implementation, here we're looking at were the items delivered on time, were the services provided sufficiently, were the items going to the right place and at the right price. This is quite a difficult one to do just from the data alone, because there's often not a lot of very good public data available on milestones and invoices and payments. But if you can do that, you can get that information, that's great. If not, you're probably going to have to speak to hospitals, to civil society organizations, or in countries where donors are providing a lot of the funds, you might either want to go to the donors themselves and see the information on their websites, or sometimes donors have a specification that communities have to do their own monitoring, and that's often called like a social audit. So look out for opportunities to actually speak to communities that way. Okay, and just one more thing before I wrap up, I want to talk about the fact that these red flags are sort of like the tip of the iceberg. It's really important to use them, but then go beyond that story and see what the possible bigger problems might be. Like what was it about the health system that caused problems in the first place? Was it underfunded? What are the bigger problems in the supply chain? And as we turn into the recovery, what are government's priorities? How are they spending their money in the next couple of years? And as we've seen from some of the examples I've been showing, the organizations that have been doing a lot of the best investigations are able to really dig deep into these contracts because they've created their own databases. They put in that extra effort of organizing the data, cleaning it, and then analyzing it. And they're able to use it over and over again for all these different angles and different items, and it proves to be valuable over and over again. And yeah,
Great.
I think that's where I end it.
Thank you. Thanks very much. That's so interesting. All the red flags. It's like a process, really, that you've helped us talk to us through. I just wanted to ask you a question, Sophie. You said you've done a really good run through of things to look forward, and they're also in the guide. And we'll, as we said earlier, we'll circulate your presentation. But it seems to me that a lot of the way this stuff is coming out and is through journalism. Is that a fair assumption, that most of the investigations going on into wrongdoing and these billions of dollars of contracts being awarded are thanks to journalists around the world doing the work?
Yeah, I mean, it's a combination of things. I think it's the journalists, and also we're seeing a lot of civil society organization researchers who are using the same kind of techniques. Ideally, we would love to see governments producing this data themselves and creating their own databases and sharing it in an accessible way. But at the moment, it really seems like journalists who are committed to public interest journalism are producing the data and even making their own publicly available searchable databases available. Like ProPublica has done that in the US recently.
Yes, indeed. Thank you for that. I'm sure you'll get some questions. I think we'll turn to Eunice now. There's quite a few questions, I believe, Eunice.
Yes, everybody seems to want to know whether there are any tools or databases to monitor the relief funds being sent out. Someone asked whether there's a database site for African countries, database suggestions to track global tenders and suppliers. And someone also asked, where in the chain should we look for whistleblowers and human sources?
Okay, those are quite different questions. Why don't I ask, well, should we start with Sophie? On the databases in different continents and countries. I guess you might know that, but please, Roman and Ernesto, jump in. And while she's answering that, maybe you could talk a bit about whistleblowing, the two journalists, because you, I'm sure, have thoughts there. Sophie, go ahead.
Yeah,
please.
so there are particular examples of countries that have very good databases. And what I'll do is I'll just share some links in the notes. We've got a good list on our website as well. But probably the best place to start if you're looking for a database or even just to understand the procurement rules in your own country is to go to the World Bank's public procurement database, because they've got a really good directory there.
Great, thanks. Did you want to add to that or ask or answer the next question, Ernesto, or go ahead?
Yes, of course. As I said, it's important to contact the companies that are sending their offers to authorities, but are not being taken into account by them. I think that this is an important human resource. Also, it's important to get in contact, for example, with former directors or former workers from state agencies. For example, here, our main agency is called GIJN in terms of is the one that give sanitary registration to these medical devices. So it will be a good idea to get in contact with both former directors or workers from this organization, or with persons that actually works in that organization. So maybe you can try to reply this in your own country.
Yes, thank you. It was a point you also made, Roman, about how once you've got the data, it's only the beginning. Do you want to, really, you need to check it and so on. There was one of the 3 questions was about that. Do you want to respond to that? Any other suggestions you can make to add? You're on mute, sorry.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say something new here, because the best whistleblowers are victims. And in the terms of procurement, in our case, there were 2 types of sources. So definitely doctors were victims because they were forced to buy the equipment that was worse. They were forced to buy the Russian ventilators. And they talked to us and they provided some very useful data and knowledge, which was useful to analyze the data, the technical stuff about the ventilators, why they are worse, why some are better. The second type of sources are always competitors, those who lose contracts. And of course, you got to be careful with them, because these people, they are offended because they lost their money. But simultaneously, in many cases, they are insiders. They know the market, they know the main players on the market, and they might provide you with the very useful data that you should, of course, double check as a journalist. But yeah, go to competitors who lost the bids.
Good, thank you for that. Eunice, next round of questions, please.
Yes, this question is about how often does Ernesto and Roman watch government procurement announcements? What do you look for? And someone asked, what kind of suggestions do you have for the countries who don't have procurement data available for public? And this last one, what are the typical schemes or strategies employed by crooks for bid rigging that would be helpful for journalists worldwide to look out for?
Okay, thank you. Those are 3 quite different ones. So just to recap, how often do you monitor the government procurement process as a journalist? An advice when there's no rigging, when there's no information in a country, or there's no information about a sector or something, and then how the bid riggers work, typical techniques. Maybe all of you should have a chance to answer and pick the ones that you think you'd like to add to. Why don't we start with you, Roman? Sure. How often are you monitoring this regularly? You have to unmute. Yeah, sorry.
Very cool question, because I used to monitor them from day to day. It wasn't like a process, an ongoing process. But with the new tools, we wrote another script that actually gets the 10 biggest contracts every day, and then it sends us a newsletter. So now we're monitoring it every day, but we don't invest really much time in it because we use the technology to do it for us. So that's the first thing. Then what were other questions?
Well, one was when you don't have enough information, how do you, I guess you just have to go back to traditional,
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, there are
Start calling people.
yeah, there is nothing else you can do.
Okay, and then have you discerned, the final third question was there, have you discerned a pattern, the way that the corrupt officials are operating in order to rig the bids, these if there are bids, or ways of getting these contracts that you've observed?
Yeah, but Sophie has talked a lot about it, and
Yeah.
it's really typical in every country. Inflated prices, fake competition when companies which belong to the same people compete against each other. Sometimes they make the technical documentation in a way that only one company can fit in. And this way they cut other potential suppliers from the bid. And many others.
Ingeniousness, yes, there's many ways, yes, I'm sure. Sophie, did you want to pick up on that? Because you did talk about it, but yeah, what are you observing as some key things to look out for?
Well, just actually coming back to how to find the data, if you don't have a database, we have something that's called the Open Contracting Data Standard. And although that's used for data, it's also really good just for structuring your information. It's like sort of the 300 most important details you need to be able to understand a contract from start through to finish. So it's really useful if you're even just doing, interviews, or you're making FOI requests, to figure out exactly what particular bits of information you need to be able to do the calculations or analysis you want to do. And you can build then your database manually by filling in the information into a spreadsheet yourself. And there was a really good example of that in Nigeria, where with a project that's called Vazhnie, and they basically got the procurement plans from the government to see how much money they'd set aside for contracts, and compared it against their list of contracts and how they were implemented, to see whether the spending was matching up with the budget, and also whether the spending was going where they said it was going to go in the plans. And then what were the other questions again? Sorry, it was the bid rigging.
There was yes, the one was on one of them doesn't really pertain to you, because it was really about how often you're monitoring the governments. I mean, you guys are monitoring all the time for slightly different reasons. And the last one was just patterns of bid rigging and corruption in these contracts, and whether, there's in a sense specific things to look out for that would, you have noted them all really in your red flags. I don't know if you want to add to that.
Yeah, I'd recommend looking at the red flag methodology in detail on our website, because it's really comprehensive. There's like 150 of them. It's way too much to go through in this presentation. But also it's really difficult, I think, with the bid rigging. Like the whole point with the COVID emergency procurement is that there's so much spending that's just being done through direct awards. It's really hard to figure out, whether it's being done fairly or not. And that's one of the reasons, for example, that we're advocating for governments to be transparent about their deals, even if it's after the fact. We need that information about contracts to be able to look back later and see how those decisions were made and whether they were made fairly. And if there was fraud, that we can actually go ahead and try and prosecute these people for, ripping off people and basically making it more difficult to save people's lives. And there was one more thing I actually wanted to address, which was when do whistleblowers often come forward? And we often see that in the award stage. Particularly, I think it was Roman that mentioned that it's really, really great to look at competitors who might have missed out on a deal because it was awarded corruptly. You'll often find, companies are really great sources of information about corrupt deals, because they're missing out on business themselves. And if you can't find it in the data, you might also want to look back in court records, because there might be governments who are actually, companies that are actually suing the government for unfair deals.
And just to get the scale of this, so can you remind me again, Sophie, what figure that you're using at the moment for the amount of money approximately at the moment we know has been spent on COVID-related procurement? Public procurement, sorry.
Yeah, I mean, it's not a complete figure. That's really important to say. But at the moment, we're saying it's about 40 billion.
That's a lot of money. Okay, thank you. Ernesto, please, would you like to add to that? I mean, how often are you looking at the data that the government is providing there? And I mean, is it very much integrated into your daily practice, if you like? I think that was the question we got asked.
Yes, we look at these data sets on a daily basis, but not always the government is updating these data sets as fast as we wish, right? And when you look at these data sets, we are, well, Sophie gave a detailed description of the red flags, but maybe you can search for overpriced purchases and purchases that are totally unrelated to the COVID-19 pandemic, like, I don't know, the construction of stadiums, of another kind of goods that are not related to confronting this pandemic. And I also want to add, I think that is not so related to the questions, but it's important that here we are talking about corporate groups and corporate schemes around the world, but we need to not forget that here we are also talking about citizens that are being affected. So
sure, it's
important to also take in account that in our investigations, we have a human face to talk about it, because these corruption procedures, these irregularities in the procurement has a direct consequences in the citizens of our countries.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And yeah, I think made also by Roman earlier. Totally agree. Eunice, I think there's a few more questions for each of the speakers, as I understand.
Yes, should we do them all?
No, let's do one at a time, because people can't remember, including me.
Okay. There were a bunch of questions for Roman on the clearspending.ru database. Is it a public or civil society organization initiative? How do you know the information is reliable? And what software did you use to do the coding? Was there anyone who helped with it? And the last question, are you also using FOI requests, even though the answers will take time?
Those three for you, Roman, please.
So ClearSpending is a reliable source of data because it uses the official procurement database. So we have a separate procurement database, which is not bad as well, but it doesn't give you an API opportunity to analyze the data. So that is why we use ClearSpending. It's reliable, but of course, you, as a journalist, you got to double check everything, including yourself. So the second question was what type of software we use. So it was a script in Python, which I highly recommend to learn every investigative or data journalist. And the third one was if we use FOI requests. We do, although they're not very efficient here in Russia, because according to the law, authorities are obliged to reply, but they never do it. And so, you know, I don't remember any cases when we got really good responses from them that were useful for our stories.
Thank you for that. Next ones, please, Eunice. Next questions.
Yes, the next batch is for Ernesto. I think he mentioned a database just now. Could he repeat the name of the database? And someone asked whether there's any website about public procurement similar to clearspending.ru for Latin American countries. And there's a question about whether any companies in Peru are involved in the development of vaccine. And the last one, the idea of following the companies as they sell in different countries seems excellent. Can you suggest which products or companies might be the best targets, and are you organizing this cooperative work?
Good. Okay, Ernesto, thank you.
Okay, there's a lot of questions, but I made share with you in the chat the links for the two data sets that we use. The one is there is two data sets. One is published by the OCE, that is in Spanish is our state agency that is in charge of the procurement, supervised procurement in Peru. And the second one is published by Peru Compras. That is, in English, is something like Peru Purchases. That is the one that is in charge of making the negotiation with the providers. So I might share with you these links in the chat. The second question, can you repeat it, please?
Eunice, do you want to just repeat it again? Would you mind?
Hang on, I was looking for the unmute.
It's on the vaccine in the, if you're working on procurement related to the vaccine.
Okay, yes.
Sorry.
Yes, as far as I know, there's only one university here, a private university that is trying to develop a vaccine. It's called Universidad Peruana Cayetano Heredia Peruvian University. And they are trying to develop a vaccine, but there hasn't been so much development in the last couple of weeks. So. And the last one has to do with this network, right?
Yeah, and also, exactly, and also what specific items you would recommend looking at that are sort of cross-border, and then, you know, then the network, indeed, that would be needed.
Okay, the first item that you should be looking is the test, the PCR molecular test, and the so-called rapid test, because I think is the one of the having been purchased by all of our governments worldwide. So one is that. You can also be looking for masks. I think that 3M is a big company that is selling his N95 mask all over the world. And also there is a lot of Chinese companies that have a wider presence in our region and also in some countries of Europe. You can search for Origin, that I know that they are selling their products in Spain, in some other countries of the European Union, in Georgia, and also in Peru and in Brazil, I think. And also Wonfo Biotech is a huge company related to the pharmaceutical sector in China. And I think that he also asked about our network. Our network is called Red Palta. It's the acronym for like Latin American Journalists Network for transparency and against corruption. In fact, palta is in Spanish, I mean, in English, palta is avocado, but okay. It's kind of inside jokes that we have. And it's, and the members of this network are La Diaria from Uruguay, El Faro from Salvador, Poder of Mexico, well, Ojo Público, Ojo con mi pisto from Guatemala, and La Nación de Argentina, and That Sketch from Colombia. So all these newsroom, we are working right now in a third investigation. The first one has to do with, well, it was before the pandemic, and it has to do with the purchases of milk in our countries. And the second one that it was published amid this COVID-19 pandemic, we keep track of the legal documents published by our governments in order to regulate the procurement for this emergency. So you can also, I will share with you the website.
I think the question was referring to wider global ones. Very interesting, though, that it's really going well in Latin America with your work. I mean, I think there's a bigger question about the global networks. I'm not sure we have time to discuss that in much detail now, but maybe we could end with some final comments from each of the speakers. If there's anything you haven't had a chance to say, please go ahead. Because we're kind of running out of time now. I mean, thank you everyone for all your questions. We've reached the end really almost. I'm just going to give each of the speakers a last chance for any observations they might still wish to make. Sophie, do you want to start? with any final thoughts that you might want to share today.
Yeah, I mean, I think I just sum up with the 4 main steps if you do want to look at red flags and understand what's happening in these contracts. And it was nice because actually Roman and Ernesto mentioned these themselves. Oop.
You're trying to share your screen.
Can you hear me okay?
We can hear you
okay,
fine.
Great.
Don't worry.
Yeah, so the 4 steps that you should probably follow if you're trying to look into this is, first of all, understand the procurement rules, get a really good understanding of what the normal behavior is before you can spot the abnormal behavior, choose what red flags you're actually going to look at, then build your database and conduct your analysis, and then finally share your findings and decide what format is going to be, make the most impact with your audience, and help to make the massive market of government contracting serve the public better.
Good, thank you very much for that. Roman, any last thoughts you wanted to share?
No, I think I've, you know, I said everything I wanted. So.
Okay, for sure. Ernesto, any final?
Yes, just remember that some challenge working with data have been there already before the crisis. Classic problems is like problems with data scope, also the data quality, and there's also now some new challenges that have been exaggerated or created by the new crisis. So just have a little bit of patience and just keep working, and know the players, know the rules, and team up with other journalists in the region and in other countries.
Great, thank you very much. Thanks all. That's a kind of perfect segue for me to point out that we're doing a webinar in exactly a week, actually, on data. In fact, it's the first of 2 webinars GIJN will be doing on data. Next week's is with the well-known information graphics expert journalist Alberto Cairo, and he'll be joined by 2 other people, including Amanda McCulloch, a public health and data visualization expert, and also Karen Urish of the New York Times graphics department, who's been working on a lot of the COVID reporting. So that's next week. And this data issue is absolutely massive. So we hope to be able to help with a couple of webinars at least for starters. And some of the points made here today about data also have been extremely useful, as well as in other ways. So thank you very much. And I wanted to start first by thanking my colleagues at GIJN, there's many behind the scenes working on this, and I really wanted to thank all of them. I also wanted to thank Russian colleagues, both my colleague, the Russian editor of GIJN, and also our 2 translators, Yana Husak and Andrei Besidin, who have been translating in Russian today for us, and we hope to do this again. Yeah, so finally, I want to thank almost finally, I want to thank you all in the audience for participating today. We hope you can join us again. And finally, I'd like to give a huge thank you to our 3 panelists, to Sophie, to Roman, and to Ernesto, for a really, really good discussion, really good tips and information, big stories to do ahead of us. And you've really helped us to understand the issues and shared your practice. So thanks everyone, and to the audience, I hope you come back next week. Thanks a lot. Bye for now.
Bye.